Good morning, and thank you to the organisers for letting me talk a little bit about the work of the Global Drug Survey today. I hope the title of the talk will give you a little bit of an idea that I want to talk about things slightly differently today, so I'm not going to focus on injecting drug users, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the contentious area of the fact people use drugs because they like them. I want to thank an awful lot of people. I'd like to thank the over 140,000 people who have taken part in our surveys and our apps over the last 2 or 3 years, a fantastic expert advisory committee, some of whom are here today, and a number of collaborators from around the world who help us run our surveys. If there's anyone from Italy, Greece, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Israel, Canada, South Africa, or Luxembourg, we'd like you to come and play with Global Drug Survey next year. Please come and talk to me. We run the biggest drug survey in the world. It's got bigger year on year. Last year's drug survey was translated into 9 languages. We had partners in 17 countries, and we received just under 80,000 people from around the world. In November 2014, we'll launch Global Drug Survey 2015. Our target's 150,000 people, and we're hoping to be translated into at least 12 languages. As I said, if you'd like to take part, please come and talk to me. The reason we get really big numbers is we collaborate with media partners. So Global Drug Survey is an independent, self-funded organisation. We don't take money from large research organisations or government or the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry, but we collaborate with media hubs who can get information and promote our survey. And in the space of about 5 weeks, we get enormous numbers of people. What we also do is make sure that the information is fed back to the public as soon as the results are out. So we provide our data back to the public about 4 months after data collection. We don't provide any music, but if people want music, they can also add that to their coverage. And we have diverse media partners. We do have music magazines like Mixmag and Hot Press, but we also have large kind of media organisations like the Huffington Post, The Guardian, Zeit. We had 20 Minutes in Switzerland. And the idea is that that information which is relevant and practical gets out to the public really quickly and generally in a way that we think is fairly useful. There are 3 questions that are driving this talk today. The first is that harm reduction is basically common sense. And since it has the well-being of the individual as its central tenet, I sometimes think, why don't people always use drugs more safely? Now, I understand if you're an injecting drug user, a lot of that's around availability and access to drugs and drug paraphernalia. But for all the other drugs, cannabis, ecstasy, cocaine, alcohol, a lot of it's around individual behaviors. And I just think, why aren't people a bit smarter? The other thing is that most people who use drugs aren't dependent. They're not problematic drug users. And yet we basically only ever worry about people with drugs once they're starting to run into problems. And that just strikes me as being a little bit odd. And the other thing is that we don't often talk about pleasure when it comes to drugs. And if your opening conversation with someone who uses drugs is around harm, they just might not listen. But if you start talking to them around drug-related pleasure, they might have a little bit more interest in what you're going to say. So this is the overview of the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about personal barriers to behavioural change. So whether you're a doctor, a psychologist, a social worker, a harm reductionist, what we're all interested in is encouraging behavioural change. And I want to think about some of the personal cognitive narratives that we all use that prevent us changing our behaviour. I'm then going to talk a little bit around the drugs meter and the drinks meter apps. I've been polluting the conference with all those little cards. And to show how they can overcome some of those personal barriers. And finally, I'd like to talk about the Highway Code, which is the first harm reduction guide that was voted for by drug users. So there are some things that make us all the same, I think. And these things can be barriers to us changing our behaviour. If you engage in something that is risky, or you take drugs, or you do something you know might be a little bit harmful, one of the first things that you think about is, look, this behaviour might be a bit risky, but I'm special. You know, most of us overestimate our invulnerability to harm. We're a little bit smarter than average, we're a better driver than average, we've got better genes than average. You know, people smoke. And, you know, they know that smoking causes cancer, but other people, not them. People drive without seatbelts because they're better than average drivers. People get married and think they'll never be one of the 1 in 3 people who get divorced. People have sex. That's obviously touched a nerve. People get married, they get the lottery. The trouble is, if you overestimate your personal invulnerability to harm, you don't take precautions to keep yourself safe. So that's the first story that we tell ourselves. The second story we tell ourselves if we do something that's a little bit risky is that we look to our friends. And if you just think you're like everybody else, then obviously what you're doing just isn't a problem. And that's because we're smart. We choose our friends to make us feel better about what we do. Of course, the other thing is if you take drugs, the other issue is that you have to balance up any health concerns you have with the fact that you just might like getting high. And that's okay. Finally, if you do something that you think might be a little bit risky and you might want to get some help, one of the real problems, and that's what drug policy really increases, the whole issue of stigma and shame. And that means people don't seek help and advice. And so through the information we've collected over the last 3 or 4 years, we've put these into the drinks meter and the drugs meter apps, which are ways of overcoming those personal barriers to behavioural change. And these things are available online, on the app stores, and they provide information that is personally relevant. So the first way that we challenge the idea of people being special is we personalise the feedback by adjusting the risk that people have, by asking people questions around their mental health, their physical health, their personal health, how old they are, how they choose to use a drug. And all of those factors affect the amount of a drug that people use. And that means it's very difficult for people to ignore the advice. Because when you see a generic harm reduction message, you can go, yeah, I know that's important for other people, not for me. When you personalize information, which is what you do in a one-to-one clinical session, it makes it more difficult for people to ignore it. And so we have a risk adjuster. The next thing we do is we challenge the idea that you're just like everybody else. And this is the idea of using social normative feedback and behavioral economics. Because what we do is we'll actually compare you to everybody else who's filled in the drinks meter or the drugs meter. And now the database is just being updated. We're talking around 150,000 people. So when you fill in the cannabis drugs meter next week, you'll compare yourself to 50,000 other cannabis users. And in fact, now you can also compare yourself to people within your country and within your age and gender group. And that starts challenging people's idea of the fact that they're normal. Normative misperception is something that people do to make themselves feel better. If you tell someone, in fact, their drug use isn't normal, in fact, it's really high, in fact, for many people, that will reduce their drug use. Importantly, you don't tell people they're less than average, because if you do that, people tend to increase their use. How do we get around the whole idea of the fact that people like getting high and they're embarrassed and there's issues around stigma and shame? The information is anonymous, it's confidential, and as well as giving harm reduction advice, the drink and drugs meter will also give you strategies that might improve the quality of the pleasure that you get from drugs. So I just want to give you a quick example of what this might look like. These are only available in English at the moment. If there's people who want to translate these into your languages, please let me know, that's available. And we're just updating the drinks meter so it will have WHO guidelines as well that will work for Switzerland and Germany. So it's online, app stores, but also at drinksmeter.com. And about 93% of people who do it would recommend it to their friends. And interestingly, this is not a group of people who are problem drinkers. This is just people like you, some of whom may have problems. And about 25% of people who do the drinks meter say at the end they will reduce their drinking, which for something that you can roll out on a population basis is potentially really important. It's based on the fact that we know 1 in 3 adults drink too much. And one of the key findings this year from the Global Drug Survey across the world was 1 in 4 drinkers who were at risk of being dependent, so they scored 20 or more on the audit, thought that their drinking was average or less than average. In the UK and Ireland, it was 1 in 3 drinkers thought they were average or less than average. And that delusional belief was greater among the heavier drinkers. And about 80% of people say that they are interested in knowing how their drinking and drug use compares to other people. because what people are interested in is themselves. So we find out where you live, how old you are, your sexuality. We ask about sexuality and gender because within the drinks and drugs meter, we also provide you with gender-specific safe sex advice as well. But we work out how much you drank in the last week, we work out how much you spent, we give you a visual representation of units, we then convert the units into cheeseburgers, chocolate bars, packets of crisps, daily equivalents of your calorie intake, which can be really depressing. And then we say to people, so how do you think you compare to everybody else? Now, I want you to be really honest. Who in this audience is an average driver? An average driver, you know, brum brum car? 3 of you. 4, okay. So that means everyone else, I assume, is a better than average driver? So when it suits you, we all believe things that make us feel happy. And so we say to people, how do you think you compare to everyone else? And we show you. The drinks meter now is around 25,000 people. And then we show you how you compare to your national guidelines. National guidelines are really interesting. In Germany, we had 22,000 people, and 65% of the German population didn't know what the drinking guidelines were in their country. And most people around the world didn't care either. But anyway, that's a German problem. We also tell you how many days you binge drinked, and then we adjust your intake. And so we ask questions about your medical history, your personal history, your age, and then we adjust your units. So if you have a hepatitis C and you're on antidepressant, we increase the amount of alcohol as a way of showing your vulnerability. And then we give an explanation. It makes people really uncomfortable. And that's what you want to do if you want to create behavioral change. We then do the 10-item audit. We tell them if they've got a problem. And of course, by this time, we're telling people that they're fat, they spend too much money, and they drink too much. And so we say, would you like to reduce your drinking? But we call this enjoyment because some of you tonight, possibly, will go drinking, and some of you will have unnecessary drinks. It'll be 11, 12 o'clock, you'll think maybe I should go home, and someone will go, no, have one more beer. It's those unnecessary drinks that we say to people, which drinks could you do without? And you tap them, and it shows you how many units, calories, and money you would save over the year. We also have these for drugs. So we have 9 drugs meters for ketamine, cocaine, MDMA. They're all being updated at the moment. I think the new cannabis drugs meter is released tomorrow. It shows you lines of cocaine and ketamine, which I weighed and measured in the laboratory. And it shows you how you compare harm reduction advice, safe sex advice. You can go and play with them. So the final thing, and it goes back to one of the things that the conference has spoken a lot about, is that harm reduction started with peer movement and peer knowledge and peer expertise. And so one of the things that we did this year is we asked people, actually, what harm reduction strategies do you use? And we didn't ask them just whether they used them, but we asked people how important those strategies were on reducing risk. But we also asked them, how does that harm reduction strategy impact on the pleasure that you get from drugs? And that's really important. So this is called the Global Drug Survey Highway Code. It's been online now for about 3 weeks. It's been downloaded 10,000 times. It's free. It's only in English. People want to translate it, please let me know. But this is 80,000 drug users telling us what they do when they use drugs. I think it's the first harm reduction guide that's been voted for by drug users. And I think it's the first harm reduction guide that explicitly talks about pleasure. So the takeaway message is that safer drug use seems to be more fun. That's like saying you can eat pizza and lose weight. And if you can start a conversation with people who use drugs by saying, I got some tips here for you that will make drug use more enjoyable, they might listen to you. If you just mention it might make drug use safer, that's a bonus. So this is the sort of stuff that we we came up with. Basically, we think drugs is a bit like driving. It's an inherently risky activity, but there are things that you can do as an individual that can reduce your risk. So we did them for GHB, ketamine, alcohol, cannabis, blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to show you a few examples. So this is MDMA. So the number one thing that people thought was most important was staying well hydrated. 90% of people normally do it, and it has either a neutral or positive effect upon drug-related pleasure. For each strategy, we give a little explanation, a little bit of science, and if you just look at the dial now, so keep an eye on friends. Drug users are really altruistic. They look after each other. Test dose a new batch, use a trusted dealer, set limits on the amount used, use the home testing kit, avoid using when depressed or anxious. Drug users are pretty sensible. Eat properly, wait 4 weeks between sessions, go to sleep, eat food. I think this is a really good strategy, but not that many people do it. Take a rest from physical activity, drink less than 6 alcoholic drinks. We've got it for cannabis. Don't mix with tobacco, use a vaporizer, don't cycle, don't drive. You get the idea. You can look at it online. And we think it's quite useful, and the feedback that we've got is it's quite useful as well, and it's pretty. Magic mushrooms, that was interesting. So we spoke to MAPS in America, and we said, how often should you take LSD and magic mushrooms? And they said the important thing is to let the experience integrate before you take another trip. So we've taken advice from experts. This thing's really annoying. Know your mushrooms. Know where you have to point this bloody thing. Plan your trip in advance. Leave time between trips. We've got new drugs. Alcohol was really interesting. So alcohol is the only drug that we have safe guidelines for. Nobody pays any attention to them. 20% of people around the world paid attention to drinking guidelines. The last thing I'll mention is if you do research or festival work, or you work in a clinic, this is an ultra-brief screening tool that can basically be used to map drug use around a geographical area and do rapid data screening. It runs on an iPad. It means you could run it around a country or even around a particular city. And basically, you put down the time and place where you collect the data, you hand it to the people, it takes 3 minutes. Age, gender, sexuality, what drugs have you used in the last year, what drugs have you used in the last month, how often have you used, how much have you used, and how much have you drunk today, and we tell you how many cheeseburgers you drunk today. I'm quite obsessed by cheeseburgers. I understand I have a problem. And then we give you a little report. So it's a really quick way of doing data analysis. All of the information and a lot of the results from the Global Drug Survey this year are available online at globaldrugsurvey.com. And if you'd like to find out any more information, please come and grab me, but I'll stop there. Thank you.